Welcome back to Ambitious, and I am very excited for today's episode because obviously, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, this is a podcast, and I have a lot of questions from you as to how do I start my own podcast? If I have a podcast, how do I make sure that it makes sense maybe for me as a brand? Maybe I want to use this as a tool to be able to grow my business. How do I leverage my podcast to generate sales for me? And all of the other questions we're going to be diving into today. And so I am absolutely honored to be joined today by Hayleigh. Hayleigh is somebody that I have the absolute pleasure of calling a client as well as a friend. And I really just want to pull back the curtain on everything that she knows about the 101 of really leveraging a podcast for you and for your business. She has helped clients to not only just do audio based podcasts, she has helped people to do audio, video, leveraging this as core content pillars and platforms for their businesses. She has helped people to generate sales from their podcast to blow up their brands. And might I mention, which is why I think she is an incredible resource, she's done this in a variety of industries. She has helped people not only in the business space to leverage sales for their podcast, but literally in multiple different genres of business. And so today we are getting into the nitty gritty of everything from promoting your podcast, the structure of it, the titles of it, the topics, how much do those matter, the name of your show, all of the things that we're going to look at to say, how can we leverage your show if you either are wanting to start a podcast or you currently have one to really take it to the next level. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Alrighty, you guys. Well, welcome back to Ambitious. I am so excited today to be joined by an incredible guest. We just finished wrapping on recording on her podcast, and I am so excited for us because we're just both revved up and we're ready to go now. And so I can't wait to continue this conversation about all the 101 of what you need to know about leveraging a podcast for your business to help you to scale and to tap into a even wider or even deeper with your existing audience. So, Hayleigh, welcome to Ambitious.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I honestly am so excited to dive in. When I said like prepping for our show, I originally had like 6 pages of notes because I know how much you know about podcasts. And I was like, how do I distill all of the things that I really want to unpack and make sure that people know? And so today, for the high level, I really want to unpack like what is the do's and the don'ts, what actually matters when it comes to a podcast and how to leverage it. I don't know if you feel like this, but I feel like podcasts are massively on the rise in the sense of like compared to say 3-4 years ago, it feels like there's way more than ever. Is that just like what I'm seeing, or do you feel like that's also true on your side?
No, I'm seeing that too. So I started my first podcast in 2018. So like way before the big rise of podcasting in 2020. And then I saw a ton of podcasts start during the pandemic and it was great, but a lot of them stopped because they stopped having so much time to be able to podcast. You know, we were all so free and available during
Yeah.
2020. And then now the podcasts that have stuck around are seeing great results. And I think other business owners, especially I'm in the business space, so I'm seeing way more businesses start strategic podcasts now to really grow and connect with their audience. And so,
Mm.
no, you're totally right. There is such a rise in podcasting right now, which obviously I love.
Yeah, no, totally. And just like for you guys to know, like Hayleigh does like when we're talking podcast management, we're not just talking light editing, okay? Like she does actual like full front to back management, which is why I wanted to have her on because she basically takes, podcasts, chop those into clips for people to leverage on social, helps them to really optimize with everything that they're doing to use this for a bunch of different reasons. And so, you know, Hayleigh, for yourself, when it comes to someone having a podcast, like what would you say is a reason for someone to have a podcast? Or like what are kind of the intentions that they can leverage this for their business?
Totally. So, like I just said, I work specifically with business owners, mostly women. I do work with men, but I think my marketing just attracts more women. So, I'm
Yeah,
not mad about
same.
that. But I'm seeing so many businesses want to connect with their audience deeper in a way that's like different than they've ever done before. I think, as we were talking about on my show, short form content is not as easy as people think it is, right? I have such a hard time sitting down and recording like 30 TikToks I've tried to start TikToks a million times and it's just not for me. I'm a long form kind of girl. And so a lot of businesses are seeing the value in being able to have their CEO, or if they are a smaller business, like them be able to streamline their time by sitting down for an hour and then outsourcing it to someone else who can cut it into clips and edit it. But also a big part of it is on TikTok, on Instagram, while yes, those are short clips that people can find forever, it's really not as easy for them to get back to that at a later time, like podcasting. Podcasting with SEO, with everything. I have people listening to my very first episodes that I had like 3 years ago. People are
Wow.
still listening to those. But I can't say the same thing with the reels that I created 3 years ago. You
Mm.
know what I mean? It's just a so much of a more streamlined content creation process than anything else. So
It has
really,
been a game changer in that bucket. Like I was saying to Haley, like when we record a show, we have, let's just say, like an hour episode, and that hour episode gets made into 10 clips, and then those 10 clips get dispersed on, say, 4 or 5 social media platforms. Well, that is now one long hour someone can listen to or watch on YouTube, or listen to your headphones on your walk or whatever it might be. And then you now also have the ability to take those 10 clips and disperse those. So now you actually have 50 clips of your podcast all going out on social media within a 7-day period of 1 week, and then you do it again the next week. So when you really think about, like, the way that I looked at it, which kind of, like, pushed me over the edge, if you will, to starting the podcast, was to see the potential of, like, all those seeds that were being planted. Like, if you're going from, I'm posting 5 days a week on Instagram, and now you potentially, with having 1 extra hour a week of filming max, obviously some of your clients even do half an hour episodes, right?
yeah,
Yeah, so, like, even with a half an hour episode, thinking about chopping that, let's just say, into 5 clips or to 8 clips and dispersing those, imagine what would happen to your business or your brand if you went from 5 touch points with your audience to 50 touch points with the audience or with the platforms in a given 7-day period. So, like, when I started to kind of see the numbers like that, I was like, this is literally a no-brainer. I don't know why I'm not already doing this. And I think one of the biggest bottlenecks, if I'm gonna be honest, was the thought of, like, the production side of it. Because there's a lot that goes into a podcast that I don't think most people recognize. Like, obviously, we've got, like, the bootstrapped podcast, which is like your microphone and, like, in a van on the side of a hill
yeah,
recording. Like, 100% that's, an option from a set perspective. But even if you do that, you still have post editing and you still have chopping into clips and writing captions and all the pieces. So, talk to me about production of a show. Like,
yeah.
what do you recommend for someone to have success with a podcast? Like, what do they really need? And then what would be the ideal situation that you would want someone to have?
Okay, I love this question, and it's almost making me laugh because when I did start my business like 5.5 years ago, 5 years ago, video podcasts weren't around. And at that time, people still came to me with like, how am I going to record this? Like the production side that I can't even wrap my head around it. And I'm like, okay, well, just sit in your closet with a microphone. The clothes around you will make sure that it's soundproof and like you'll be fine. There won't be any echo. It'll be fine. And then people started seeing the value of video podcasts and then they wanted to get on YouTube. And I was still getting the same questions like, how am I going to record this? How am I going to have guests on my show and make sure that their video is good? So I think that the goalpost keeps moving for like production quality. Of course, there's people who still, I have a client who she has a great podcast. She has a really cute closet and she records in there. And so, like, no one would know that that was her closet, but it is. But like, really, I think that the production of podcasting it always does change, but the content that you're talking about, like the words you're saying, that is the most important part that has been around forever. So let's just talk about for business owners, like what is important to go into a podcasting or podcast set or podcast content, whatever it may be. Number one, of course, great content, like planned out content, content that your audience is asking for that aligns with your business. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, but
Mhm.
podcast strategy, having a
Yeah.
podcast in itself is not a strategy. I'm sorry to break it to you. Just so
People are dying inside. They're like, oh, damn. I thought I could just have a podcast and put it up and that would be enough.
right. And so that is actually a really common thing that I I'm like, "No, it's not." And I wish it was. I wish it was. And back in
Yeah.
2018, it
Don't
absolutely
we all?
was.
Yeah.
Right. That would make life so much easier. But so obviously having great content and then, simple video and then being able to have it in a way that is easy to edit. You can hand it off to an editor, whatever it may be. But then you can leverage it as clips. And so I have still clients and people come to me who are resistant to video and just want an audio podcast, which is fine. You can still have audio podcasts. There's great audio podcasts only out there, but you're missing a whole different way to reach your audience if you
Yeah.
don't turn on your video. So I think it's really just better to click on your video, have it whatever the background may be, but you're going to be able to reach a whole new audience just from that one simple change.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think I was saying to Haley, like, one of the things that was a big delay in me doing a podcast, which might seem silly, was literally the set, which was like the actual space and the tech of it all, of like the camera and the lights and all of it. And like it's literally just all purchased off of Amazon, camera included. Like everything is like you can put it all in a cart and have it in your house in the next 48 hours. But I think if I'm gonna be honest, the deeper level of it was the fact that, like, I didn't wanna put out something that wasn't, like, quote, unquote, "professional" or quote, unquote, "curated" or, really, frankly, if we're gonna be honest, perfect before I put it out. And I was saying to Haley that one of the biggest pieces of regret that I have is that I didn't start it sooner. Because I think, to her point, which I 100% agree with, I think it's about the content. Like, I think it really is about, what people are learning and what you're adding as value to them. But the other thing that I've been kind of navigating around production, it was interesting. So I was traveling and I realized that I had one of my peers' microphones and I was listening. I audit my own podcast to say, like, do I find it boring? Because if I do, then I just switch up the way that I'm recording it. And so sometimes I'll be in the car and I'll listen to it for like 20 minutes and see kind of what I think. And it was interesting because I found when my audio quality was bad, I actually didn't want to listen to the episode as much. Like I found like when it was kind of not really great quality in audio, it was not compelling me as much. And I'm curious, like obviously you can start a podcast with basically like your iPhone if you really wanted to and your
Mhm.
headphones if you needed. But I'm curious in your standpoint, like, do you think that good quality video or good quality audio does actually increase the amount that people consume or like the even maybe frequency of how much people might consume your show?
Absolutely.
Mm.
100% I do. I think that good audio quality is the most important thing. And if you're going to do video, you should do it right. I mean, quote unquote, right. I mean, having good production as a business owner really does make you stand out from the other podcasts because you just seem more professional, you seem more put together. And if your business, the reason you're starting your podcast is to grow your business, 100% having better quality is going to help you. And so the same with me, if I'm listening to a podcast and the audio is weird or just off or like echoey or
Mm.
whatever it is, I choose to turn it off, and there's so many podcasts out there now and that sounds harsh, right? And I don't mean it to sound harsh, but the audio quality is very important to giving your listeners a great experience. Same with filler words. I mean, there's so many AI tools now that you can just clear out those filler words. Some of them are necessary, but I do like it when I'm able to remove all of those to just clean it up a little bit and save your listener time. I mean, it's great that they want to spend an hour listening to you. Really don't take that for granted. Really, really make sure that it is worth their time, content wise and quality wise.
Mm. Well, that kind of brings us to content, right? Which I know that like there's all all the sides that we could dive into. When someone's mapping out content, like I definitely will share kind of the 101 of what we do, but I'm curious, where do you start with your clients around mapping out what they talk about, why they talk about that? Like from my knowledge of some of the people that I've had podcast conversations with about their shows, they'll just sit and be like, "What should we talk about?" And they'll have a random idea about something
Yeah.
and they'll just record on that. And so I'm curious, like, obviously, with your clients, you go into data and all these things. Like, how much of the content is really based off of the creator or the host, kind of like inspiration, ideation of whatever they want to talk about, and how much to you, like to your point of using this for business, is strategy. Like we always hear about strategy of Instagram, strategy of, TikTok and things like that. But what really is the content strategy of podcasts?
Yeah, that is a great question. I get that all the time. It's like, what does strategy mean when it comes to podcasting? Like, is that just
Yeah.
a made up term? To me, a podcast strategy is almost where your business and your podcast are married and they have the same goals, right? They're going to the same end goal. So, what I see in a lot of podcasts now, it's a common mistake where people will have a podcast that they're just to your point. I want to talk about this fun topic. I find this really interesting. Okay, let's just give it like an example of dogs, right? Like my dog is right behind me. We'll just say that they have a podcast where they just talk about dogs. I love that. There are podcasts like that. And then their business, let's say they are a business coach working with, let's just say, you know, how you work with
Yeah.
scaling women. Okay, two different audiences that those are going to reach. So if you want your podcast to work with your business, they do need to work towards the same goal. So that to me is what the strategy piece is. And then the content that goes into it, I'll say about 70% of it should be strategy, about 30% should be what you truly do want to talk about in relation to the podcast of like the bigger strategy topic. Because if you're not having fun with your podcast, you're not going to continue doing it. So if you want to
Mhm.
pop in a solo episode about what you've been up to, or a solo episode about life changes or whatever it is, amazing, do those because that's really how your audience is going to get to know you on a deeper level. But most of the content should be working towards whatever that goal is that you have set. So the first question I ask any client that I'm working with on sales calls or once they sign is, what are the three things that you want to achieve with your podcast? Like, let's think short term, like 3 months. What would make you feel successful as a podcaster in the next 3 months?
Mm.
And then year, what do you want to achieve in a year? And then what's the ultimate goal for your podcast? Success in podcasting means so many different things to so many different people. I will never get the same answer twice. I have clients
Mm.
that want to be like talk show hosts, and then I have ones that just want to be able to have their show to maybe reach a few new people and, you know,
Yeah.
inspire them to do something. Those goals are so different, but success to them are going to be different things. And so that is the first thing I always want to know. Like, what are your goals and what will make you specifically feel successful?
Mm. Well, like I think, for me, it's when people ask me, like I have clients who said, "Can you audit my podcast?" Like in the sense of like what you see, what do you think of it? Is it good? Can I refine it? And when we talk about goals, I kind of categorize them into three buckets, which is like personal in the sense of like it's really just not really necessarily connected to like a business objective. It's still under the umbrella of your business, but it might be just like a trust building thing where it really is not necessarily directed to sales or any of these pieces, but really just like depth with your audience. The other one that I look at is brand expansion, which is really where you'll see, in my opinion, quite a few hosts that are very guest heavy in the sense of like it's really meant to basically have cross exposure, getting, basically your face in front of other people's audiences. There's a lot of leverage that way. And the third one, which I see, which I'm not, I would say, as big of a fan of going all in on, which is sales, where you see basically people who are using this as like their top of funnel sales engine. And, we talked about this on your show as well. That can get very messy because people can oftentimes go too far with that it really takes away from the essence of why somebody is listening to you or watching you to begin with. And so, if we think about going deep with your audience, getting a little bit more personal, maybe more brand visibility and getting that, or maybe we're looking at the aspect of sales. I feel like you must get this question all the time with prospective clients, but like if someone's going to see momentum with their podcast, how long does that take? Because I am of a firm belief that a podcast, while you can have short-term wins, and I'm like happy to kind of share, what that looks like and stuff for us. What I would say is I really look at podcasts as a long-term play,
Yeah.
which is like this is a matter of you planting seeds every single week. And while yes, something may happen in the next month, it may take 6 months. It may take 2 years before you really start to see the podcast take off, in my opinion. But I'm really curious because obviously you have insane results for your clients' podcasts. When someone's setting their expectation of starting this, and they want to start a podcast, or maybe they have a podcast, but they're not seeing results right now, how long does it take for a podcast to become quote unquote successful or start to see those markers happen?
Yeah. Okay, you're gonna hate this answer. It really depends on what the podcast is about,
Oh, I'm
right?
right there with you. I'm right there with you. They might not like this answer, but I'm right
Right.
there with you.
No, so it is absolutely a long game, right? Podcasting is not what you're going to have success with overnight. And there are those outliers like influencers who start podcasts, or even Call Her Daddy wasn't successful overnight, right?
Yeah,
It was
years.
successful, but it did take years to get to the point where she is now. And so it definitely takes time to have a successful podcast. When I ask people what their goals are, to my last answer, like, if they tell me that they wanna make money from it and that's their number one goal, it kind of does raise some red flags for me just because podcast advertising, I don't think pays as much as most people think it does. And so
Mm,
and this is a tip for anyone who has a business that wants to start a podcast, prioritize running your own ads rather than being so quick to run other people's ads like HelloFresh or those other brands that really
mm,
promote in podcasting. Your offers as a business owner, most likely, I can almost say 100% of the time, will make you more money than running ads in your show,
mm,
almost 100% of the time. So when it comes to like success and like the ramp up of a podcast, I would give it about a year plus to be able to start seeing those results. I was just listening to Alex Hermosi's book, and he had a podcast for 4 years before it got traction.
mm.
4 years. And I mean, look at him now. Like,
Yeah.
people love his show. They listen all the time. It's like a top show now. But it took 4 years for him to get there. And so
Mm,
along with your podcast, you should be building your brand around it. You should be showing up online. A podcast can be so much more than just a podcast if you make it that. It can
mm,
become its own brand, kind of like what you were saying with Ambitious. I mean, this could be its own brand one day. And that's kind of the way that you are building it, with having its own Instagram, having its own branding, right? It ties into your business, but at the same time, it could be its own thing later on. And so, really, that does go back to what goals you want to achieve with your show. But I would say give it some time and just look at the data, see what's working, see what's not working,
mhm.
and really be asking your audience what they want to hear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was sharing with Haley that, in the first several episodes of Ambitious, we had sales come in that we were, frankly, if I'm gonna be honest, real I was just like, "Put my head down and record. I'm not gonna look up from this thing for at least 2 years," was my original perspective around it, because I knew it was a long-term play. But then to have, like, within the first 6 weeks of it launching, to have, like, 150, $200,000 worth of sales coming in, we were like, "Okay, whoa," because this means that the depth and the connection with people did have a lot of potential. But I so agree. Like, I think that if people are really looking at this when they're doing it as a long-term play, and you can get your mind and your expectation around that in a fair way, it allows you to really have the success with that long term. Of, to your point, with us, with Ambitious, the goal was not to use this to sell. Like, this is not, you don't hear me pitch a lot. You don't hear me offer, my offer this, my offer that. We want it, even for social proof, it's anonymous for a reason, because we're just making it about the story and the value and the insights or the wisdom around that client, not about them and, go seek them out and all of these things. And so I've just found that the sales can also indirectly happen by the level of depth that you're providing to people. And I actually listen to several shows that have their own ads, which is like, "Hey, we're selling this course right now. If you want this promo, get it now," kind of thing. And they have preset ads they just drop into the shows depending on what's going on when that thing launches. And they've had a lot of success with that by basically bringing the business back to their own business rather than getting outside advertisements for their show. And so, when we're thinking about looking at this in the sense of like a business growth lens, what do you see with podcasts in the business space that's not working in that effort? So, like, what are you seeing on other people's shows? Maybe you're seeing it on my show. If so, like, I'm fully okay to be on the chopping block. What do you see on shows that you're like, I can tell this obviously is a business intention, but like this is not going to help you. This is not doing anything for you. Is there certain practices or patterns you see on business podcasts that are actually potentially capping them from seeing growth?
Yeah, there's a couple. And no, Kate, your show is amazing. I love listening to your podcast. So a couple things that I notice in shows that they do want this business growth, but they're not getting it. They're not seeing the results. Number one, sometimes they're leaning too heavily on guests. I mean, you're the only constant in your podcast, right? You have solo episodes and then you have guests come and go every week. Sometimes people have their guests come back, but most shows don't. It's just a one-time guest. And when you lean too heavily on having guests on your show, it's hard for the audience to know things about you and your business. And that was the intention all along, right? To connect with the audience deeper for your own show and for your own business. So that's number one. Guests make it really easy to have a podcast. So I totally get why businesses do this.
For sure. It's way easier than solo episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even for me, I've been podcasting for so long, and, like, whenever I record a solo episode, I, like, stare off the screen, and it's awkward. That's why it's edited,
Yeah.
right? It can be really awkward.
Yeah.
So, number 1, that would be what I would say. Another thing would be really not having clear, defined goals. So I know I keep talking about goals through this, but really it's important to be clear on that, even if you don't have someone helping you with your show, because every week you should be putting in the steps to be able to get to that ultimate goal. And so if you're having random episodes, I'll give you an example. So I had a client come to me and she had a financial podcast for women over 40. And I mean, it was great. It's like top 1%, but she wasn't having any sales from it. And so one thing that we looked at when I was auditing her show was she had no calls to action, none. People didn't know where to go to her next. And once she started putting in those calls to action that were clear and not like, you can follow me here and sign up for my newsletter here and make sure you connect with me here and all these different things, like overwhelming them with calls to action, she made tons of sales right after. People were hungry to work with her. They just didn't know how. And so that would be another piece of not having those goals and not having those clear calls to action that will get people to get out of the podcast platforms and onto your platform. If I could share one more, I would say not building a brand alongside it. So not having an Instagram account, not having places where people can go for that call to action, whether that be a newsletter, whether that be a YouTube channel. People want both sides. They want the audio of you, they want the video, they want the podcast, but they also want to see what you're posting in other places. I know for me, whenever I find a new podcast, I love listening. I'll listen to tons of episodes, but of course, I want to see what they're posting on their Instagram. I mean, we're nosy. So if I'm
Yeah.
listening to someone on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'm like, what does this person look like beyond their logo? So
Yeah.
having a place for people to come and connect with you and be able to get into your world even deeper, that's a place where I find that a lot of podcasters are using it for business kind of lack. They kind of lean too
Mhm.
heavily on one side or the other.
Well, like even in that note of brand, right? Because I think, a lot of people would love, like, if we take, like, for example, like a Call Her Daddy or Diary of a CEO or, any of the major podcasts, people would love for it to be its own brand. But again, like podcasts are a decent amount of work in the sense of like the prep that you put in, the recording, the post production, and all the pieces. And so, like, if someone's like, okay, like I'm going to put in this work, I'm going to put in the time or the effort or the investment, what are key elements in your opinion that help somebody to build brand with a podcast? So, like for us, one of the things that we have really focused on is, again, not making it like the Kate Perkovic show, because
Mhm.
it really is not meant to be about me. It's meant to be about value, that I can just be like basically the translator or the middle person between the information and getting it to you. So that was one of the pieces. We also looked at really having like core values, almost like you'd have for a business, and core values and beliefs around, what we share and why we share it, and kind of like core elements of success, if you will. We also, very similar to a content strategy for marketing, also have like buckets of topics, right? So like you're not going to hear me, maybe you'll hear my dogs because I record in my basement, but other than that, you're not going to have episodes of me talking about my dogs,
Mhm.
because again, the subject matter has to fall within these buckets that make it kind of like intentional. And so I think people also go back to brands they know that they can rely on because they have consistency in what they talk about, what they believe, and like what they stand for. And usually brands are connected to some overarching mission or belief or kind of like, label that you self-identify with. And so even when we named the show, we were really intentional to say, okay, well, if we name it, we had a bunch of different ideas of, the CEO next door and, all of these different things or like different names that we had come up with, but none of them really embodied the value of the person that was going to be listening. And we were like, okay, like who is that person? And we chose the name to be a brand name, not an SEO name. And so like I have a client who has a really successful podcast and her podcast has gotten a lot of growth simply based off the SEO of the name. And this is something that people often ask around brand, right? Which is like, how do I decide to go the brand way? Should I be SEO heavy? And so like, how does someone navigate the brand decision and how to build brand when they're trying to either launch or grow an existing podcast?
Yeah. Okay. I love that. And that's a really good example of you can go the SEO route or you can pick. So the podcast I just launched is called Podcast Cafe. Not really a lot of SEO there, but I wanted to give the example of, I'm sitting down with someone with a cup of coffee and we're talking about podcasting. That's why I went with that. But the client I was just mentioning, where she has a great SEO name. I mean, people search this all the time that are her ideal listeners. And I think the reason that she did that specifically wasn't necessarily for the SEO, but it was just what she was thinking about at that time. So, like,
Mm.
what is this podcast going to be about? It's about this. So, very straightforward. So, to the point of brand building, podcasting just gives you so much content that you're able to then connect with people so much deeper and really like get in front of them in a longer way than you've ever been able to before. So, focusing on the clips, that really is a brand building activity. Focusing on the content piece of having, like I said, those solo episodes that are really strong, like you being a strong host, that's a brand building activity. And then also being able to guide guests, strategic guests through amazing conversations, that's also a brand building activity. So I think just strength in podcasting, which is something that comes with time. You're not going to be a great podcast host from day one unless you've had like a TV show in the past or like
No.
a radio show. I hope, like I said, people listen to my first episodes, which honestly is kind of embarrassing because that was a long time ago. And I'm definitely a different host now than I was then. But
No, no question. It changes within like 2 weeks. I
it
was using a
does.
fish
Mhm.
lens? Anyways, I was like, I used the wrong lens. As I said, I bought everything off Amazon, and it was mainly, if I'm gonna be really transparent, you guys, it was me and YouTube at like 11 o'clock at night, and I bought a bunch of random crap and got it sent to my house. And so I remember when it was sent off to editors, basically that do the equivalent of what Hayleigh does on our team, which by the way, Dear Kell's agency and AHA, a sister agency, are the two agencies we use. They're amazing. And we sent them the clips and they were like, why do you look like that? Like,
Oh my God.
why is
That's
your face
funny.
like that? And I was like,
Yeah,
my face, like what? It's a camera. And they're like, no, like there's something not right here. And so the first couple episodes were terrible, just terrible. Yeah.
that's okay. That's okay. We grow as hosts. And
Yeah.
so definitely being open to that growth is also a really important thing. So I love that you've got a new camera.
Oh
That's
yeah, we got a
important.
new lens. Let's just update you guys. We got a new lens. We got a new everything. We're good to go now.
Fisheye is
Um,
very like 2018, isn't it? Like that was like the thing then. Like
That makes
people
me
love the
feel better,
fisheye.
Hayleigh. That makes me feel better. So like even if it wasn't, I'm gonna hang on to that because
Yeah.
that's what makes me feel better.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
actually the video was not ideal. And then someone edited the settings for me. And I don't know how to use these cameras or any of the stuff that I bought. I just purchased it and it got delivered and I plugged
Mhm.
everything into an outlet. And they got it actually properly set up for me. And I was like, I did not know that that camera could do that quality. So
That's so
now
funny.
I almost wish it wasn't so clear because when I have breakouts and stuff, it is crystal. It is HD. It is
Right.
wild, wild. Okay, so we now kind of have a little bit of an idea of like the ideas around creating topics around the podcast. Talk to me about like, say someone's like, I want to have a podcast, but I don't have time to manage it. What are we looking at, like spectrum wise, of the different levels of outsourcing production? Because I think sometimes people are wanting to do a podcast as a scaling business, but they're like, I do not have time, barely to even record it, let alone edit it and do all of these things. what does that look like to delegate it? Like, what are some of the things that basically would be taken off someone's plate if they were just able to give it away?
Yeah. Honestly, podcast editing is the easiest thing to delegate because then you still have control over whatever you want to have control over. So I write my show notes for my clients and I also will create them graphics along with editing. But if you just want someone to edit your show, that will save you like 2 hours a week just
Mm,
from that. Then if you want to go a step further and have someone write the show notes, you always have the ability to go back and like proof them, edit them however much you want. But it is nice to have that layout there. And then a step
mhm.
further, if you're like, yeah, that sounds great, but I really just don't want to do anything with my podcast. I just want to sit down, press record, and like send it off, which tons of people do. So there's no
That's me, you
shame in,
guys. That's
I
me.
mean, yeah, I mean, it's great to be able to do the content creation, the fun part, the
Fun part.
episode planning and then the interviews. That's really what a lot of podcasters strive for. And that's all things that you can outsource. I always say for my clients, I can do everything but be you. I cannot sit down
Yeah.
and look like you and sound like you. So anything other than that, 100% can be outsourced. So even the clips that we're talking about, people will cut the clips for you and then send them to you and you can improve them. So you still have control over everything, but it
Mhm.
just depends on what level you want to outsource. So is it just truly a podcast editor or is it a podcast strategist or is it someone who completely will like run the whole podcast account for you and you don't have to do a single thing?
Well, on the note of the clips too, which is something I definitely wanted to ask you because I feel like there's like, people who are like, I don't want to have to do video. I don't have to get like get ready to film and all of these
Mhm.
things, right? What is your opinion on video or no video? Because I know obviously it is leverageable to your earlier point. You're going to be able to tap into an audience that you may not otherwise be able to tap into. My opinion is wherever I can push someone to get on video, go
Mhm.
get your butt on video because the chopping up of those clips and that whole production flow that you do for clients and that we use is, in my opinion, so insanely impactful when you think about 1 hour of filming or a half an hour of filming and the amount of content you can get out. And for me to think about someone recording the same equivalent of a podcast and not doing that blows my mind because they just would love to not have to get ready. What do you think? Like video, if you could like say like honestly, if I could recommend blank, would it be like, hey, it doesn't really matter? Or do you think it's like do video if you can at any point?
I recommend video 100% of the time. It
Okay.
gives you so many new opportunities. And I love reality TV. Okay, I really do. I love Real Housewives. It's like my favorite show of all time. And
Okay.
honestly, if you are feeling self-conscious about your video setup, whatever it is, go look at some of their podcasts. They're literally in their kitchens just recording, and they have some of the top podcasts out there for people love reality TV. And so
Yeah.
there after COVID, I feel like a lot of things changed, and there really is 2 directions you can go that I wanna talk about because after COVID, people were working from home. We know that we're working from home. It's really I'm traveling right now, so I have a bed behind me. Like, I don't think that's gonna be abrupt to anyone. No one's gonna be like, "Oh my god, she's recording in her bedroom." Like,
Yeah.
a lot of us are doing that. A
Yep.
lot of us are. So, really, there's no judgment in just turning on your camera and being able to have all of this new content. Even if no one listens to your podcast, like, the content that you'll get from it, that's worth it in itself,
Yeah,
honestly.
incredible. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
The other direction that I see a lot of people go is recording in studios if they do in-person interviews. So, absolutely, there's studios in every single city that you can go to, sit down, they have all the equipment, you don't have to buy a single thing. Sometimes they'll even do some light editing for you. Of course, you're
Mm,
paying for this time to be able to record in the studio, but if video quality is what's holding you back, go to one of these places. Even if you're traveling, they're in every single city. You can just rent them, and then if that is what's holding you back from turning on your camera, do that because you're never, ever going to regret having the video content.
agreed.
What other medium are you going to be able to turn this video into a blog, into clips, into,
Yep.
short, whatever it is? You cannot turn a blog into video. You can't turn short form into long form, but you can always turn long form with video into so many different pieces of content. I mean, I even have clients that record podcast episodes and they use it in places of their sales offers. You know, if someone meets them and they're like, "Hey, tell me more about your business," of course they'll do that.
Yeah.
But they can also redirect them to the podcast episode where they say, you know, like, "Your thing's, you know, server to seven figures."
Yeah.
Okay, you have an episode about that, right? So you could always
Yeah.
send people that direction. It's really just the gift that keeps on
Well,
giving.
like every podcast, what people don't understand is that every single topic, if it's actually valuable, is a mini lead magnet.
Exactly.
Like, you're like, "Hey, like, do you teach content?" You're like, "Yep, here's my content episode. This teaches actually one of the frameworks that I teach will kind of give you the high level of what my perspective is." To your point, what's your story? Like, tell me a little bit about kind of like, where can I learn more about you? Hey, here's an entire hour where you can hear me go at length in great detail about my entire story and every chapter within it, right? Like, there's so many benefits in the way that they're structured that way. And like for me, what I found with the repurposing of the clips, we just did a data meeting for like kind of going through all the different podcast data. And what's really interesting too is like when you take a podcast, looking at how the data looks when you're listening to it is different than when someone's watching it on YouTube, which is different than when they watch it on Shorts, which is different than TikTok, which is different than Instagram. So what's been really cool is to see how one clip, the exact same clip, there's nothing that's been changed about it. It's identical, same song, same, thing me saying in it, same way it's edited. It can do entirely different on YouTube Shorts than it does on TikTok, than it does on Instagram, than it does on Spotify.
Mhm.
And so what we realized, even most recently, what we opted to do was we originally had everybody listening on the audio platforms and then had people watching on YouTube because we're like, okay, great. It's a great way to build a YouTube audience. Well, then once seeing our Spotify data of how many people were listening on Spotify, we were like, wait a second. So many people are consuming of all the podcast data. Majority, I think it was 89% of people are consuming on Spotify, which tells me, hey, let's lean into Spotify and how to make sure that the user experience there for them is top notch. And so now we'll be basically having video on all of our
Mhm.
Spotify episodes directly in Spotify. So you don't have to go anywhere else to find, basically the experience of what we want to make sure everybody gets access to when they listen. And so I think it's really also looking at like the way that we dive into marketing for the business. The same thing can be true for podcasts. Like podcasts have so much data. Like even, I was diving into a peer's podcast data for Spotify as well, because they have a really cool podcast section now of data. And we were seeing how many people got exposed to their show versus how many people clicked on the show versus how many people listened to the show. And so something that I am curious about is titles. Because
Mm.
obviously, to your
Mhm.
point earlier about SEO, right? The goal that everybody has is to grow their show. And so I'm curious, with considering SEO and the titles of episodes, or maybe even the title of your show, your podcast art, talk to me about how to grow a show. Like if you're like, right now I'm marketing to my existing audience, but I want to get it even bigger. How does somebody grow their podcast once they've started it?
Okay. I love this. And really, I think going back to the content piece, like being able to answer people's questions before they even ask it is going to be one of the easiest ways to grow.
Mm,
And even like we were just talking about if people keep asking you how you started your business, if you have a podcast episode about that, people don't have to keep asking you. They can go and be proactive and hear it. And then when they're coming to talk to you, they're already ready to maybe work with you or connect with you further. So having that in mind when you're titling your episodes or even your podcast is very important because a mistake I see a lot of podcasters do is instead of having some description in the title of the episodes, they'll just have like episode number with guest name. Oh my God, no one's going to be searching the guest name. I see
Oh,
this all the time, right? It's just
okay.
episode number with Hayleigh Hayhurst, whatever that is, like
We
whoever the
wouldn't do
guest
that to
is.
you, Haley. We wouldn't do
Thank
that to
you.
you.
Thank you. But it's a common mistake because that's how people are going to find your episodes. So
Mm.
recently, I started getting into running, as I think almost everyone my age is doing now.
I saw you and you're
I know.
crushing it.
Thank
Absolutely
you.
crushing it. So
Thank
cool.
you. So when I was trying to learn more about this, the first thing I did was obviously go into podcast. I went into Spotify and I looked up the question I had. So it was like how to be a faster runner or whatever I was looking up, right? It came up with all of these episodes that were answering my exact question.
Mm.
If your episode isn't titled in a way that is SEO forward and is answering those questions, like giving a preview,
Mhm.
you're really doing yourself a disservice because not as many people will find what they're looking for. Even if you have the perfect answer, if your title doesn't explain that, you're really not going to be able to grab them as they're searching. They're going to go to the other podcast that has a better SEO title name. So when I was looking for, I don't know, maybe it was like running nutrition tips or whatever it is, I saw all of these, and then the next thing I did was look at the show notes of the episode. So, is this really going to answer the question that I have? Of course, don't give it all away in the show notes, but for business owners and for brand building businesses, brand building podcasts, I think it's really important to have a solid description of what people can expect before they listen to your episode.
Mm.
There are tons of podcasts about business out there nowadays. I don't say that to discourage anyone from starting. I am just saying that to be one step ahead of anyone else who might be having the same
Yeah.
podcast as you. If you have better titles and better show notes, that's going to stand out to your listeners more than a great logo and great content, right? It's like the first impression that they have of your show
Right.
is your show notes, your titles. And so then the next question you asked about the podcast title, like the name of the podcast, I always say don't name it your exact business name. So I wouldn't name my podcast Espresso Podcast Production. It doesn't make sense, right? Well, maybe it does because people would be searching it. That's really not what I wanted to portray through my podcast. So I have two shows, Employee to Boss, where I talk about the entrepreneurial journey. And then I also have Podcast Cafe, where I talk with podcasters. It took me a long time to come up with these names. I had a million different ones. I think, Kate, I even ran like a million by you for Podcast Cafe before I came up with this title.
Yeah.
But really, I think having something that does make sense once a listener knows
Yeah.
who you are, that's what you should really go for. And then the way you title your episodes and write your show notes are just a step further.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that like the podcast opportunity in general, when we think about like to your point where you said, there's a lot of business podcasts, is there any point in doing it? I think it's the same kind of idea when we think about business, right? People will say, well, there's a lot of people in my niche. It's too saturated, it's too saturated. And my answer to that is then be better. That like if
Exactly.
I'm going to be honest, that's the simplest explanation I can have. If you want to stand out, people say, "How do I stand out with my podcast? How do I stand out?" The way you stand out is by things like Hayleigh just noted of, the SEO of the titles and having really intentional descriptions that give people the essence of what they're going to learn. Say on YouTube, having chapters where people can see the different
Mhm.
segments of what you're discussing in the show. I think having intentional clips being put out, right? Like it really is about, in my opinion, like leveraging as much as you can to show the value in what you're talking about. And I think to your point around content, being conscious around what you're talking about, how you're talking about it, and is it entertaining? I think that obviously we always want to be educated. We always want to be, we want to have value, some takeaway. Maybe it's humor's the takeaway. Maybe it's like kind of hits you in the heartstrings. It's inspirational or motivational is the takeaway. Maybe it's literal tips and tricks and it's actual step by step education. But I think the way to stand out in any industry is a matter of making sure that when someone consumes you, they are getting something from it paired with community. Because I think that like there is this brand connection to your point of like, building brand with the podcast. The more that you feel connected to the host, the more that you feel connected to the show, the more consistent and loyal you are as a consumer. And so, interestingly, even for me, I will say on the brand side, podcast cover art is very interesting to me because the thing that I've realized is that I think a lot of people look at their podcast cover art in like Canva, but they don't look at it in the perspective of what it looks like on Spotify. As in like
Yes.
this tiny, tiny, tiny little icon, and you've got all this text going on top of it. And so, like, I think one of the biggest things that I'm basically hearing you say, and I so agree with, is like it's all about the user. It's about the user and what they're searching. It's about the user and their experience of what they're seeing on an audio platform. How big is your cover art? Can I even understand what the heck it is? Or does it give me a feeling of what I'm going to get from your show? Like all of what the audience is consuming, looking for, and experiencing is really to you the biggest success factor that you will have with being able to grow your show and basically get it discovered.
Absolutely. It's all
Yeah.
about the listener. It's all about the user. And to your point, there are a lot of podcast cover arts that are they're like so tiny, right? It's on our little phone, and then you look and you're like, "What is that?" And
What
so,
does it say? Yeah.
right. So simple is better. Simple is better.
'Kay. Now the thing I will say, so to your point of, like, Hermosi took 4 years, call her daddy, years. The thing that can happen in entrepreneurship, because we're all like dopamine junkies and we're all looking for that quick hit, that quick, I post a podcast and I TikTok and I go viral and I, put this on Instagram and I, have massive exposure. How does someone get the perspective they need to be committed to the podcast long term? Because there's a lot of pieces for a podcast, right? You're running a podcast alongside having your business. Some people are like, oh my God, this is just so much of a commitment. I have all these things happening in my business and I got to record this podcast. And potentially, if you're editing it yourself, you have to do it. And then you see all the work you're putting into it, but then you may not see any return on
Yeah.
all of your reps you're putting in. So, like the equivalent of, I think about like you're going to the gym and you're going and going and going, but like you might not see that big outcome you're looking for, that big transformation for say 2 years, 3 years,
Mhm.
4 years. How do you help people to really shift their perspective or mindset to not get burnt out in the pursuit of what is the potential of what their podcast could do for them?
Yeah. This is why I say if your only goal for podcasting is to make money, it's a red flag for me
Mm,
and for you, because I know you will burn out. I know
mm,
you will. I've seen it time and time again. The podcasts that are the most successful are the ones that focus on value, the ones that focus on what they're putting out there in a way that will help people in their lives, whether they work with you or not. I have a client, her goal is to help impact the lives of 1 million women. That's her goal.
I love it.
Every week after we post an episode, that number goes up and that number goes up and that number goes up. And closer we get to her impacting the lives of 1 million women. So having a goal like that is still tangible and you know what you're working towards, that is going to be what prevents you from burning out. Because to your point, it does take a lot of time to research your guests, research the topics, come up with topics, plan out your seasons.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time. So if you have a goal that you feel good about, that's going to get you so much farther along than I want to make $1 million for my podcast.
Yeah, I
100%.
see people who record like 20 and they're like, "So, like, subscribers." And I'm like,
Right.
so
Yeah.
wait." Yeah,
Yeah. And I know
yeah,
for me, like whenever someone reaches out and says something nice about my podcast, I'm reminded why I'm doing what I'm doing, you know?
yeah.
I'm reminded of, yeah, people are listening. And of course, like I do see positive ROI from my podcast, like monetarily. The reason I started my first podcast, Employee to Boss, is because I knew no business owners. I was a brand new business owner. I moved to a new city where I only knew 2 people. Like I knew no one online or offline from it was kind of like a crazy time. And so I started this podcast because I was thinking, okay, I'll get people to chat with me for an hour. We'll get to know each other. I'll meet another business owner. I'll be able to
Mhm.
collaborate with them. And that was my goal for the first couple years of my podcasting journey with Employee to Boss. Like, I just wanted to meet people. So every week I got to meet a new person. And every week I
Mm.
got to introduce my audience to a new person.
Yeah.
That was my goal, and that is what kept me going for almost 3 years now of that show, and every week, I'm still excited to meet new people and just get that episode out there. I love meeting people, I love talking, and so really that's what makes me keep going rather than, like, burning out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you hit on something really important there too, is like, when you're the host of a show, it's kind of like the equivalent of being like the host of a party.
Mhm,
Right? Like
totally.
you're the person bringing people together. Like you're the person bringing, like say I am the person bringing you and your information toward the person who's listening right now, right? Like you're the connector, you're the facilitator. And so I think there's also a lot of power in that because when you have really incredible guests on or when you have and you bring on really valuable insights, you're becoming the facilitator of something that could cause a transformation in the person who's consuming. Like, I have literally had people message me and be like, I did what you told me to do on the podcast and I sold my course. It was crazy. And I was like, okay, amazing. And I had someone actually ask me that. They said, do you ever worry about giving too much away on the podcast? And I was like, no, because if I give away so much on the podcast that they get a transformation, you didn't need to work with me in the first place. Cause like I wasn't directly involved in your transformation. I said something, you took action on it, and then it happened. So if that happens, because people say, how much do I give away? How much do I teach? How much value do I add? And so I said, like, just give it all away, because if you give it
Yeah.
away and someone gets a transformation, amazing. They got a transformation from your show. Imagine what would happen if they worked with you. And so like also seeing that whole connection, I so agree with the aspect of like seeing the return on it. I see the return on it for me with the messages I get from people of those transformations they get. I see the return on it in the sense of people who feel like I had somebody who messaged me and said, the clarity of what you said in X episode, I realized I was in a relationship that didn't serve me. And so I just want to let you know, like, it gave me the courage to leave. And I'm like, I would have never fathomed any of
Yeah.
that. And like, again, it's still so much in its infancy. And yet, to your point, can have such a deep impact on people. And so I think it really goes back to the fact that it really is about the impact. It's about focusing on like what it can do for the people who are listening and the domino effect it can have on their lives. So like I feel like if anyone's to take anything from today, it is like just freaking start the podcast already. And if you're going to have a podcast, consider some of these elements and making it strategic. You had an element on your show that I was like, I'm stealing this. So full credit. This is not mine. This is Hayleigh's. But we were on her show and she asked a really good question, which was, what are basically like the icks, if you will, of podcasting? Like, what are just like the elements of podcasting that, in your opinion, not ideal, guts to go, do not recommend? And so, if someone right now has a podcast, what would you say are like the top 3 don'ts?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I love
Or
this.
maybe you've got 7. If so, I've got lots of time.
Oh my
So,
gosh. So I have so many, and I mean these all in the nicest way, of course.
of course.
In a way that'll help, right?
Okay.
So number 1, prioritizing video quality over audio quality. That's a big ick to me. Most of your audience, whether you believe it or not, are going to be listening to your podcast via audio in the car, on runs, whatever it is. So if I see a beautifully set up video and then the audio is coming from like the camera or the laptop, whatever it is, like that, it's not going to sound great. And that is okay. That'll be ick number 1. Ick
Okay.
number 2. Let me think. Oh my gosh. I think, and we've been talking about this, like self-serving podcasts that you can tell are all about sales. A lot of corporates, they do this, a lot of corporate companies. And really, I think that is, of course, you want to make sales from your show, but if that's your only goal, like we said, you're going to burn out, but also it's not
Yeah.
going to teach the audience anything. So with that, like taking the audience for granted, like that is a big ick of mine. It really is, because people are taking their valuable time. Even if they're listening to it in 2x speed, they're probably still spending like 30-40 minutes with you, right?
Yeah.
If you're not valuing that is the time that they're taking to specifically listen to you and your
Yeah.
expertise, that's just being selfish. There's a lot of selfish podcasters out there. I hate to say it, but it really, you can tell, and you're not going to have those results that you want just by being selfish. And I think it's kind of like human nature to do that a little bit. So as you continue podcasting, listen back to your episodes, listen to it before it goes live. That's a tip I'll share, because
You would be
that's
shocked how many people have never listened to their own episodes. They just record
Mhm,
and release. They never audit it. And I was shocked by
mhm,
that because I'm like, if I'm not even entertained by myself, why should anybody else be? If I don't find it valuable, why should anybody else be? Like, or even the way in which you're communicating it. My number one thing, I'm working on it, you guys, is talking slower, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, like how many Red Bulls have you had? It's just I talk too fast. But I will also say there's also a lot of people who don't audit their show. And it's just like, again, like, oh, like whatever it is, it's good enough. And that selling piece, like, I went on a small tangent on Hayleigh's podcast about it because I see so many people that have their podcast self-serving, And it's actually interesting because the ones that are the most selfish are the ones that perform the least. Like if you're looking at the insights of like, why aren't people buying? Why aren't people listening? Why aren't people, going and taking the actions I want them to take of clicking here or clicking there? What's the first thing you think of when you search for a podcast? Is like, what do I, like to your point with the running example, what do I need? And I'm going to go search for that. And if you open that episode and they're like, here's how this is what I do when I run in the winter, and this is what I eat, and this is what this. And you're like, but does that mean that's what I'm supposed to do? Or I don't know how that applies to me. So every single person, this goes in all of marketing, is super selfish. So if you're going and looking for yourself and then the episode only talks about that individual, you're like, okay, there's not really anything here for me. I'm going to keep moving on. So I so agree with that. Anything else that you feel like is kind of on your mind? You're in so many podcasts. I was like, if there's anybody who's going to know, it's going to be you.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Let me think of which one I want to say.
Oh, give them all. I want to hear them all. Don't feel like you need to distill them down for me.
So another pet peeve I have in podcasting is when there's too many ads, of course, self-explanatory. Too many ads are like a killer. There's a big top 10 podcasts out there. If you know who I'm talking, I won't say the name, but you probably know who I'm talking about. His episodes are like 15 minutes long and 5 of those are ads. Okay. Great content, but it's kind of like that give and receive kind of thing where you need to give way more content. So if you have an hour-long episode and you run 3 ads, that's fine. Okay, you're giving so much more content than like a minute and a half of ads. Whereas if you give a 30-minute episode and you have 10 minutes of ads, that's crazy. Okay, one more I want to talk about is the length of your episodes, because there is a big...
I'm dying to hear. No, this I'm dying to hear because again, and I actually need to say this before you say, because I might throw myself right under the bus. And if so, you know what? It is what it is. I don't like 10-minute episodes. I don't like it. I can't stand it. I don't understand it. Why are we talking for only 10 minutes? Unless you like build it into the brand where you're like, every episode is exactly 10 minutes. So you can like listen to them on the go, or like you made it part of the thing. Then I understand it. Like if you're going to make it part of your shtick and it's consistent, fine. But I'm like, I feel like everyone, and I could be making a general statement, so you may be like, Kate, you're wrong. That's fine. But I feel like when people listen to a podcast, they want depth. Like I feel like that's part of the essence of, because if so, why not just take that 10-minute recording and put it on TikTok, right?
Exactly.
Like, I'm just curious, like, what's the sweet spot?
Yeah. If it's too short, it drives me crazy. So what my pet peeve is here is totally along the lines of what you just said. People choose these huge topics to dissect in their show, and then they ask like 2 questions and the episode's over. And you're like, oh my God, now I have to go listen to another show and never listen to yours again because like, what? That's like, that made no sense, you know? And so I really think that unless, like you're saying, you have like maybe a podcast for busy moms, and like that would make sense to have like a 15-minute show, but don't dive into like these big topics of like the best way to parent. Okay, how are you going to talk about that in 15 minutes? I don't know. That's my biggest pet peeve. And so making sure that if you are talking about these huge topics like podcasting, like, we're going to need an hour plus to talk about this because
of course
there are so many pieces that go into it. So I really don't think that any podcast has any business being under 25 minutes. That's my hot take. I really don't. I think 25 minutes is going to be, even for solo episodes, that's really the sweet spot. I think 25 minutes to like an hour and a half. Now, of course, what I have to say here is there's no such thing as a podcast that's too long, but there is such thing as a podcast that's too boring. I hate to say.
Oh, but drop from
I know it's hard to say, but
I think that needs to be one of your brand statements, to be honest, because that's the clearest thing I've ever heard in my life. There are podcasts too short. There's no podcast too long, but there are podcasts that are too boring.
Yeah.
Damn.
I mean,
okay.
There's podcasts that are 3 hours. Like, oh my gosh, what is that one podcaster's name? He's a doctor. I don't know. He had David Goggins on his podcast. It was like a 3-hour plus episode. I listened to all 3 hours of that. Like, are you
talking about Huberman?
Yes, Huberman. Yes. So his podcasts are like 3 hours minimum, right? And people listen every single week. They listen to his podcast.
Yeah.
So it's just because it's so well planned out and so valuable. And so
Mhm.
if you're having trouble creating longer podcasts, like go back to the drawing board, really think what is important for my audience to take away from this. Always, like we were saying, think about the listener first. And so make them lock in, make them listen, make them really understand what the podcast, what they're going to be taking away from it. And
Mm.
that's going to be the success of your show. That really is. So,
Well, maybe on that note too, like to you, what makes a show boring?
mm, I think, of course, not having it planned out. That
Okay.
definitely, if it's not like, if it doesn't have a through line. So I went to school for journalism. That's kind of where I got my start in podcasting.
Mm.
And if it doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end, if you don't have action steps that you can take away from the episode, that's really going to leave people feeling maybe not that it's boring, but maybe that they just feel unfulfilled with it. Like,
Mm.
okay, I just spent an hour listening to this person. What am I going to do now? Like, go listen to the next episode. So, giving them action steps, giving them things that they can like write down. Like I was saying, Kate, I think it was when we were recording my podcast, I was listening to your episode about your retreat in Montana, and everything you were saying, I was like, that's a good point. Let me write that down. That's a good point. Let me write that down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So having it in a way like that where people are definitely learning things and
Yeah.
are locked in and engaged. So even if it is an interview, asking the questions that like you want to know, asking the questions that you know your audience wants to know,
Mm.
and really just meeting them where they are. So if it's a high level podcast like Huberman, he's going to be asking more in-depth questions than
Yep.
like a different podcast that has a show for beginning entrepreneurs. So
Mhm.
making sure you understand your audience and asking the questions that you know they want to know, that's really is what makes an interesting podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the prep. I think it's like prep and it's also this aspect of like practice. I think prep, for us, I was saying to Haley, we were talking about, our flow of things. We really do research around like, what are people listening to? So we were talking about the fact that like a lot of people who listen to Ambitious also listen to The Diary of a CEO and also listen to Call Her Daddy. Like those are some of the core places that they consume. So not that we have similar subject matter to Call Her Daddy by any means, but what it tells you is just like, again, the kind of styles that people really enjoy. Our solo episodes are always something that people really enjoy. So we really are like, okay, well, what would you resonate with? We ask you guys to message us and to say, hey, like, here's the topics we're loving and here's the things that we want more of. And like, we really make it super audience centric. But even with those pieces, when we go into a podcast, like I have, a 2-page thing in front of me here of notes that are not necessarily that we covered them all by any means, but that are basically an outline of like, well, what do I know to your point of the end consumer and, the person listening to this and what's going to help them with their podcast? What do they want to know? What are the questions I get about podcasts? And so I want to make sure I integrate those in the prep. But with guests, the thing that I see that makes it really boring is
Hmm.
question, answer, back and forth. And there's no discussion type of element to it. I'd be like, so like, tell me your story. They tell this like huge, like really profound, intricate, emotional story. And they're like, okay, amazing. And I'm like, they just told you like 7 years of like these massive wins and
Yeah.
these pitfalls and like unpack, like be like, whoa,
Unpack,
I'd love
yes.
to like, it's just yeah, there's no, like, depth to the conversation, and it feels so transactional. And to your point, when someone covers information but doesn't fully cover it, when someone interviews someone but doesn't really interview them to close the loop, I'm ending the podcast being like, "Now I have to go search about this person and
Yep.
that story that you didn't unpack." Because I have so many questions. And I guess for the guest, it's great because it means that I'm going and investigating them.
Yeah.
But I think as a host, even the aspect of practice is like, and I think to even your aspect earlier, right, of the fact it's a long term game. If you're gonna do it to do it right. Like do it to really make sure that the person is getting value and that you're developing a skill. Because I do think podcasting, like marketing in short form, like selling, like anything, it is a skill. It's something that if you're not good at it, you can get good at it, but it really does come with those reps. And I think to your point of like not making it boring, the whole thing of like, how do I get better engagement, better sales, better growth, better exposure? I'm like, be better. And so like, even when you're saying like, don't be boring, indirectly in a much softer Hayleigh way is saying, be better, right? Like be better in the way in which you're doing it if you want to see better results happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I
Yeah.
mean, that's everything with podcasting. And I was even listening to Mel Robbins' podcast, and she had that same point where you're not born a great speaker, but it's one of the best things that you can do in your life. One of the
Mhm.
things that will make you up level your life
Yeah.
so much is being able to speak clearly and in front of people without, shattering and being nervous. So, really, yes, everyone should start a podcast. If you have the desire for it, you should absolutely go for it. It takes up so much brain space to be like, oh, I want to start a podcast. I want to start. Just start it. Just start it and see where it takes you.
If I could give you guys any advice, it would be exactly what she just said, which is start it. If you have the idea, I had all these obstacles that I placed in my way, and I will be the first to admit it. It was the set that I was going to have. It was the certain chair I wanted to have. How dumb. It was the certain chair that I wanted to have. It was the lights, it was the camera, all of these pieces. And I really learned when I was traveling with the show, and I had like a little plug-in Rode mic that I had. It was like, I don't know, like $120. And I had a little webcam that I had that was really, really good quality. And I just took that with me, and it was more than fine. Like, I recorded, if you guys have seen the guest shows that I had recorded in person with George as well as Gabby, both episodes were pretty close back to back. Those were filmed on a webcam. Like, they were not on a professional camera. And so, like, there's a lot you can do with technology these days to have a really, really good podcast that's really accessible. And so I think just even obviously in listening to you, Hayleigh, today and like talking about all the opportunity and all the different things that can happen with this content, brand growth, reach, depth, nurturing, sales, like there's never been an easier time. And even with AI now and the editing that can happen, if you're like, listen, I got no budget for a podcast and I'm really bootstrapping it, there's auto clipping in things like Riverside. There's, video.ai that can, chop up clips for you if you really don't have a budget for a podcast. Like there's so many resources. There's really no reason not to, other than you listening to this, basically just giving yourself obstacles or reasons why it can't happen. So, Hayleigh, I'm going to end with the question of, to be a successful podcast, you must blank.
Okay, to be a successful podcast,
To be or have a successful podcast, you must blank.
you must be authentic.
Okay. How would you define or maybe explain what you perceive in podcasting to be authentic?
Mm, yeah. Showing up as who you really are. Like, I'm not going to be one to dress like in a blazer and really like be, you know, professionally ready every single day, right?
Yeah.
That is not what people should expect from you when they get on sales calls, whatever it may be. Just show up as who you are, and also show up in a way that you would be proud of presenting your business by.
Mm.
So whether it is, I don't know, the stories you want to tell, I don't really share a ton about my personal life through my business. So I wouldn't share it through the podcast, right? But I do share elements of my life that are relevant to my business and my podcast. So really show up in a way that feels good to you, be confident, and just present yourself well in a way that you are truly proud of. And just know it gets better the longer that you do it.
Mm, amazing. Well, today was so good. I feel like it's
So
a little
fun.
masterclass on leveraging and growing and expanding a podcast. Hayleigh, if people want to reach out to you, connect with you, learn more about podcasting, consume some of your content, or again, like even go to your podcast, which I know is like literally a deep dive into the 101 of all things podcasting, where can they find you? Where can they kind of sink their teeth in to learn more?
Yeah. So the place I hang out the most is Instagram. You can find me at Espresso Podcast Production. I also have a website where you can learn more. I have a free podcast launch checklist where if you're thinking of starting a podcast, but you're like, what is even step one? You can find that at espressopodcastproduction.com/checklist. And last place, if you want to listen to the Podcast Cafe, it is streaming everywhere. You listen and watch your podcasts.
Amazing. I will say, you guys, I've seen the checklist and it's freaking epic. So if I didn't have the amazing team that I have behind the scenes helping with podcasts and I had to do it on my own, like it would be an immense, immense help. So really, really highly recommend. Hayleigh, thank you so much for coming on. This was so good. And I feel like there's just so many more questions that I had on my list. So like, we may need to do like a part 2 at some point of like
Yes,
scaling
definitely.
podcast part 2, but today was absolutely epic. So thank you so, so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate. You're an incredible coach, and I love working with you, and also
Thanks,
an
friend.
incredible podcast host. So thank you
Thanks.
so much for having me on today.
Thank you. Well, all right, guys, we will see you next week. Obviously, today was an absolute blast. I feel like I got even more nuggets, so I want to go back through today's episode and pull apart these pieces. See you next week. And as always, you guys, stay ambitious.